Good afternoon. Welcome to Well Said. Today we have Dakota Wood, Senior Research Fellow of Defense Programs in the Center for National Defense at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you for joining us,
Great
Dakota.
being here. Thanks.
We have a special episode today in memory of September 11th, 2001, which will have been 20 years ago tomorrow. I want to discuss America's military services. Dakota served for 2 decades in the U.S. Marine Corps, retiring in 2005. You served in a number of capacities and leadership roles in the Marines, and after retirement, you joined Heritage, not only to take the opportunity to criticize, I'm assuming, but also to research and write about U.S. defense capabilities. We will take a close look today at the culture of our military, how it has changed over time, and the ideologically charged social justice phenomenon that is taking hold of our national security apparatus as a whole. I called this episode Weakness Through Wokeness because it is important that we understand the costs of the progressive left's attempts to press their agenda on our military. Lately, we have seen various training modules in the military that mirror the same types of critical race theory, quote, training in our K through 12 schools and higher education. The narrative that white men are inherently evil, America's history and values are tainted, books on Marxism are added to service reading lists, recruiting ads focus more on diversity rather than on what the military actually does, and senior leadership who speak out against the left's forms of indoctrination are either fired or forced to resign. These are just some of the new trends we are seeing in America's military services. But how did we get here? Right? The unique thing about the military is that unlike other institutions of education, media apparatuses, or corporations, it is not as flexible with dissent. Insubordination is a serious offense with actual consequences written into doctrine. Therefore, by design, the military, in a way, is one of the best institutions to implant woke ideology because of its subordination to civilian leaders, as well as the fact that internally, dissent is rare and mostly trained out of service members. This does not mean that our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines are mindless cogs, of course. They are people with values and opinions. They come from a nation of outspokenness and resistance to despotic rule, and they believe in American values so strongly they decide to put themselves in a position of possibly giving their lives for these values. My concern is, what will the military look like? What will it lose when the most independent thinkers, when those who hold these American foundational principles most dear, are squeezed out or disincentivized to continue their service or even join to begin with? And all that's left are social justice warriors of the left who have adopted a political ideology into our military doctrine. So Dakota, I want to start here. The military, in a sense, is not meant to be ideological, but it is it also just meant to follow orders, or obviously there's more to it, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's an instrument of national power, right? So if you've got a despotic ruler, a tyrant, or something like that, in the past, past centuries, the military, usually conscript, was sent out to go conquer something or even to keep your own population in check. The United States is just wonderfully different in that the U.S. military does reflect American values and ideas. It's drawn from the people, especially after we went to an all-volunteer force, right? It's a recruited force as opposed to a draft force.
Right. Yeah.
But even in earlier periods, right? The Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I and II. I mean, these great upheavals in history, and so the call goes out for volunteers, and men. Almost exclusively men in the past, changed today, would flock to the colors. They'd flock to the flag. As casualties mount, it might get a bit more difficult, but you still had this willingness to serve. And today, it is all voluntary, right? So the U.S. military, composed of men and women drawn from all across American society, does reflect these things that America is something special and different.
Right.
The mission to protect the country, to protect your fellow Americans, to buttress or to expand the influence of diplomacy and trade deals and all. America lives in a big, complicated world, and you would rather have more trading partners and more countries on your team than perhaps on your competitors' team. And so when we show the flag with American military power, how does the military comport itself? Is it coherent and cohesive? Does it really reflect what America says that America stands for? Right. So this idea of the military reflecting the country, composed of people drawn from our society, it is America that's being presented even on battlefields. As horrible as those combat actions can be, are you behaving differently than your enemy?
Yeah, so I want to pull on this. Our military reflecting the values of the society that it represents, essentially. Um, what happens when these values contradict kind of the origin of it, what the military is supposed to represent, kind of understanding, and we can go a little bit more into, if you want, like the political background of like
Sure.
civil military relations, but I'm just, what happens within the military when you start to see the kind of more ideological politics of that society be reflected within the military?
Right. So in some ways, the military kind of lags the broader cultural trends. You know, if you see something, especially in a younger generation, usually something becoming different, then if you're recruiting from that different social fabric, you know, with a different perspective of what's acceptable or isn't acceptable, that's going to start to come into the military, and those junior people do rise in rank and then become senior people, you know, 10, 15, 20 or 30 years down the road, right? So in some ways it lags. And a great example would be in society in general today, the normalization of homosexuality. You know, half a century ago, it was still very much stigmatized, you know, verboten. We're not going to tolerate that. And so you had military policies that refused homosexuals the opportunity to serve in the military, right? And so if you were an older person in the military, well, that's the way we do things. And then somebody new coming in who had no problem in high school or college or, you know, different parts of the country, for them, this would be normal. So what's the problem, right? So we do see this kind of lagging indicator. In other ways, it leads the country. If you wanted to talk about gender integration or racial integration, an administration or influential voices in Congress can say, look, we're going to integrate you know, blacks and whites into the same units. They're going to have opportunity for command. It shouldn't matter what your skin color is. So even though maybe in general society, there are still these ideas of racial segregation, the military can be a leading example. So here are two you know, instances where it lags because of new folks coming in from a different societal slice, where certain things become normalized, right, and fully accepted. And in other ways, you can force change, right, or implement change. And because of the discipline, following orders, it's the right thing to do. You can really show the rest of the country how these things can work out, right?
Yeah, and so by using the military, so obviously what I described in my opening remarks, this is not the first time in history we've seen then the civilian leadership kind of utilize the military in a way to step over societal norms or step ahead of societal norms in progressive ways. So
and just to interrupt, it doesn't mean that every initiative
this is what I want to talk
is a good
about.
positive thing. You know, it is a Judeo-Christian based society. You do see the broader argument. Again, I don't want to focus on this homosexual thing, but it seems to be a very well-known exemplar of these sorts of debates. Okay, so if you do have a progressive agenda and you're trying to impose that, what better avenue through which to impose that than the military, where you can appoint senior officials, implement that policy, even if they aren't helpful, like critical race theory. Right. So it can be used for good and bad.
I completely agree. And this is why I wanted to kind of focus a little bit more on what are some of the trends we're seeing today that are really damaging to our military culture.
Well, I mean, critical race theory is one of these things. So, you know, this philosophy, this theory, which isn't much of a theory if you're saying that this is right and we'll implement it. You know, it sets people against each other. You know, based on your skin color, you're either oppressed or an oppressor. You're either privileged or not privileged. You know, you're a victim or you're somebody who's traumatized and exploiting. So if we look at the military as a team organization, where you do have a hierarchy of authorities, you know, a commander of a unit, well, is that commander black, white, male, female, you know, Hispanic, you know, whatever that might be, shouldn't their advancement to that rank or that position have been based on merit? One, did they earn it, or was it a token? Do I want my military leadership to reflect demographically in certain percentages of broader American society, and I don't have enough numbers of a certain type of person, so we're going to artificially put that person into a key position. Well, what does that do with respect to the individual? If
Yeah.
subordinates think that, well, you're only there because you're a white
Yeah.
or a female or an Asian
Mhm.
or something like that, as opposed to earning it by merit, well, it makes it very difficult for that commander to then have the respect to be viewed as credible in their position. So it actually harms everything that we know the military to be, because it's not based on merit, it's based on favoritism, right?
Right.
And the same thing, right? So in small units,
Mhm.
if a sergeant orders a lance corporal to take a satchel charge and charge an enemy bunker, well, if this thought that this person is black or white or male or female ordering me, and the only reason they pick me is because they're inherently prejudiced or biased, that we have these divisions within our military population based on ethnicity or race or gender. And if that's being implemented through these federal policies like critical race theory, where you have trainers, equity advisors, inclusion sorts of guidelines and all, and we want to force the military to represent or to reflect the diversity of America, then you're introducing these kind of artificialities, and it causes doubt. The system really isn't fair, because if I'm a black person or a white person or a female or whatever, I either can or cannot make it in the system based on what the numbers say. Oh, we're overrepresented in Asian females. And so now as an Asian female, you're going to have a lesser chance of being promoted. Well, that's not helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're getting these, like, I like how you mentioned there will be this clash of hierarchies. So the military already has hierarchy built into it, specifically to encourage that kind of like team oriented outlook. And there's in identity politics, there is a hierarchy that they're creating.
Oh, absolutely.
With race and minorities and folks who like religion, men, women, all of these things. So if you try to put those in the same institution, you're going to start seeing this clash with one another.
Right. I mean, the values of the military are treat everybody with respect.
Right.
You follow the orders of your senior, because when you're a senior, you'll want those below you to follow your orders. I mean, turnabout's fair play.
Exactly.
And so if a colonel can question a general, or a lieutenant can question a colonel, then why can't a sergeant question a master sergeant?
Right.
I don't think this is the proper way to do things, and therefore I'm not going to execute the order. Well, cohesion, respect, effectiveness on a battlefield, all of that is jeopardized, and it just falls into disarray.
So critical race theory is one trend that we're seeing really pushed by the progressive government leaders to essentially, like we said, step forward over how slow society is moving on this, and then try to implement it within military. There's other ones as well. So can you explain why Marxist books, why Marxism is being put on reading lists for servicemen and women, and kind of what the drive is behind that? Because I believe one of the excuses given is that, of course, if we're fighting a certain enemy who has a Marxist ideology, it's important that we understand what their ideology is. First, I'm curious if you think that that's really relevant for soldiers on the ground.
Right.
And second, I'm curious if you think there's more insidious goal here.
Yeah, well, I mean, it does go into this larger political debate, right, about these very left-leaning, progressive philosophies based on, let's say, Marxism, right, where you have this differentiation within the public, and you have an oppressed class versus an oppressing class, whether that's controlling capital, money, or labor, or dictating production, in kind of a political economic sort of situation. So they're taking these ideas and applying them against society, communism, right, the proletariat versus the bourgeois, ruling class versus a peasant class, sorts of things. So it's this leftist ideology that manifests in different ways, whether it's based on religion, skin color, ethnicity, or what have you. And so there does seem to be a political agenda pushing that into the military. And if that is presented in a way that this is right, and what we knew America to be via our founding documents and the structures, whether it's political or education or whatever that might be, are somehow inherently flawed.
Yeah.
That is different in terms of exposing people to these ideas.
Yeah.
That is different than, let's say, a college student wanting to know more about competing political philosophies, taking a class, reading the materials, right? So General Milley is now infamous for saying, look, just because I read books on Marxism doesn't make me a Marxist. I just wanted to better understand it. Well, that statement's coming from somebody who's older, has matured in their profession, and they really want to understand these differences so that he can ensure that the American system, representative democracies, a republic, all these sorts of things, is protected, and you understand the characterization of what was an evil, destructive competing system. Okay, that's a completely different approach than what we see going on with adding books to a reading list, which then carries the imprimatur of whoever put it on there, the chief of naval operations or what have you. Or when you have what is the term now, diversity, equity, and inclusion advisors to the Secretary of Defense and others who want to make sure that these sorts of things are pressed down. And then you have training sessions where you have a military unit and men and women separate, blacks, whites, Hispanic, and Asians separate into your little groups. And now we're going to give you scores based on your privilege, that the system has recognized you more so than others. And what the result of that is at the end of such a session, wouldn't you have some people eyeing other people through a different lens?
Oh, absolutely.
You're not all part of the same team, having earned your position by merit, but you're only there because of your gender and your race. And you're only there because of your gender and your race, right? And so again, it breeds inequities, and it breeds bitterness and resentment, a sense of entitlement. I've been wrong, therefore you owe me. So maybe I feel I should be advanced more quickly, or I shouldn't get all the crummy jobs, or whatever argument you want to bring. So there's a difference again in kind of age, maturity, why you want to learn something, how is material being presented, and the tone that carries through in the actual implementation of a particular policy.
Yeah, and on how material is being presented, I'm curious on these reading lists because I've seen a lot of the reading lists, and they actually have some really good books on them about kind of like military history and understanding. If for the Marine Corps, they have one specifically for the Corps that focus on the history of like various battles or some actually like really kind of, I think was Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War, was that on it at one point? Yeah, so just like some really good classical stuff. Is the Constitution on there? Are the Federalist Papers on there? I'm just kind of curious. I only ask that because you do swear an oath to the Constitution.
And it presumes then that what you're swearing an oath to is worth that loyalty. That fealty, the service that comes along with that. So if we're saying that America is inherently flawed, why would I want to support or work for a flawed system, right? And we also, I think, lose sight of saying we in the broadest possible sense, the America, our political leaders, what have you, begin to lose sight of what the military is for. Is the military primarily a tool to enforce these sorts of political ideologies, or is its primary purpose to win in battle? And there are implications to that, right? So if its primary purpose is to defeat an enemy in battle, secondarily, it can be used for things like humanitarian assistance or leading the country and integration of various groups, comporting itself a certain way, prizing values of teamwork and all that stuff. If those are secondary, then you have to look at the level of effort you're applying and the types of materials you're presenting. Is your reading list primarily about learning from history and how to fight wars and being successful in that? Or is it applying business principles to acquisition, efforts? What's the military supposed to be there for? And understanding its primary purpose and the demands of a battlefield then leads the military to exclude certain types of people with certain characteristics. If you're an asthmatic, and you have a medical or a physical condition that would prohibit you or make it very, very hard for you to operate effectively in a rugged, austere battle environment. Well, it's not just you that would be put at risk. It's the people that you're supposed to be supporting. If I have a machine gunner and the ammo guy, right, and all of a sudden the ammo guy is winded because they're suffering from asthma, and they can't get the ammunition to the person on the machine gun laying down protective fires, well, it's not very helpful to the effort.
Right.
And so we find that, again, does the younger generation that we are pulling from society, are we introducing things that cause problems in that environment?
Right.
And these are judgment calls, and
Right.
you can't put a number on it or weigh it or, give it a color or something like that. This comes from experience, hopefully wisdom derived from the study of history and understanding the realities of a battlefield. And commanders will come to a conclusion that an asthmatic, or somebody who is severely obese is just not going to work out
Right.
in these sorts of settings.
Yeah. So the military, I mean, historically, and this is throughout history and all over the world, does have a set of standards
Right.
for who can fight and who can't. And that's based on physical ability and agility, and it's also based on mental today a lot of times mental health.
Yeah.
And it's you take a number of tests to get in, and there always has been a discriminatory factor in that the military will say, nope, sorry, you don't qualify. Even during World War II, when we needed as many people as we could get, we still turned a lot of people away because of health conditions. And so just I'm curious, when did demographic representation become so important that we started to overlook things like mental stability, and physical needs? And I'm harking back to a little bit of like either the Obama administration, kind of like, when did this start? When did this conversation start? Because I feel like part of it might have started with like women in combat roles, and then it kind of trickled down from there. But I'm curious if you think it's sooner.
I think it really became, the women in combat or women in military service has always kind of been an issue, but even going back to Civil War, Molly Pitcher and stuff like that, right? But I think it really started to come full to the front during World War II, where you had so many people that were needed. Yeah. And so you had women performing many, many more functions, quite effectively, even up onto the battle lines. Okay. So that was really looking at the differences in genders and how well they dealt with these sorts of environments, right? And really punctured the myth that, women aren't up to the task and those sorts of things, right? The same thing with racial integration, right? That, that a Black man and a white man can fight side by side awesomely well. And if you're wounded, do you care what the skin color is of the medic or the corpsman, or who the pilot is delivering that ordnance on target, in close air support? So these were all great examples. But to your point, I think the current kind of socio-political sorts of debates we're seeing now, to me, comes to mind back in the Clinton administration. Where you had the don't ask, don't tell policy. So again, we go back to kind of this homosexuality thing, and what's so wrong with a homosexual joining the military, right? I mean, it was just a very big debate, back then, and the compromise was anybody can join if you are homosexual, as long as you're not advertising that and not making a big deal about it, that we're not going to ask you about it, and we figure out how it works. And I said a bit earlier on about how young folks drawn from high schools, an 18, 19-year-old high school graduate, what has their world been like? And if there's no problem, then it's kind of difficult for the 30-year veteran to say, well, in my day, this would never have been tolerated. Well, in your day, it wouldn't have been. There was just a different norm, what was acceptable, tolerated. So as American society has changed over time, the population from which we draw people has changed over time. Now, this is a different debate than kind of right or wrong, acceptable, unacceptable, depending on where you come from. If you have deeply rooted religious beliefs, if a biblical text guides a lot of your things, and you're going to not agree with societal norms, right? So that's a bit of a different issue. We're talking about how did things evolve and become normalized within the military? So I believe it probably started back in the Clinton administration. And, in the political spectrum, you see these sorts of things coming from Democratic administrations rather than Republican administrations. So we saw it accelerated a bit while Obama administration was in office, and now today with the Biden administration and the imposition of critical race theory.
Right.
It has really, really become an aggressive thing. And we see this in the American political left of center or extreme left
Right.
progressive sorts of movements where these ideas are really, really coming to fore.
So back when we integrated Blacks into units and into the military, and then also women, that was at a time of necessity. We needed more bodies, we needed more people who could help, and it wasn't really helpful to what we were trying to accomplish to try to segregate or keep people out. But I would say today, though, it seems more as if it's being forced onto the military. We don't need a bunch of LGBTQ people in order to boost our numbers. In fact, they represent a very small percentage of the population. But this emphasis on that group or other groups it's almost in a way kind of it makes you wonder, is it going to start pushing people away in that, like, okay, I don't want to go into the military because I'm a white man and I'm afraid that if I go in, I'm going to be, told that there's something wrong with me. And I don't want to deal with all of the tiptoeing around anyone who's in my unit who either is transgender or like a minority, and they just don't want to deal with all of that nonsense. So they're just choosing not to join. And it doesn't help that, just one more thing. It doesn't help, sorry, that in our advertisements, the way that that the recruitment is happening now, which is like, we have a serious issue with recruitment and retention right now in the military, but it's as if it's designed to only attract these kind of social justice warrior minded folks. It's not really targeting the younger generation, which I think the Gen Z actually is a little bit more mature than the millennial generation and how their outlook and their worldview, because they're not as driven by the social justice warrior mentality. But how are we gonna get these guys to join, right?
So there's a lot of factors there.
Yeah,
right?
I know. Like
and people tend to want simple answers to very complex problems. So we were talking about, is the military a leading indicator or a lagging indicator of certain things that are occurring in society? And the answer to that is, well, it's both. It just depends on what the issue is. So again, the military is a very interesting culture and organization, and that if we talk about, let's say, sexual harassment, for women, well, all kinds of numbers can come out of the the woodwork on that. Why? Because the military responds to orders. And so if Congress or an administration direct it to collect data, okay, one, what is the nature of the question? Two, how many men, for example, harass women? Is it one guy who's just an absolute jerk and loser of a person who is harassing 20 different women? Or is it 20 guys that are harassing one woman each? So the underlying questions really don't come out. But the point here is that the military can collect data and report it. And then we talk about how good or bad a particular, matter might be. Well, how does that relate to truck drivers? Or is it a farming industry? Or to home builders? Well, we don't know, because it's not really a community or a pool of labor that collects the same kind of information, right? So if you have a particular agenda, you can craft the data collection effort and report it in a way and support that by these cartoon videos for recruiting commercials and speeches on the floor of Congress, the House or the Senate, in ways that supports your argument and pushes forward a certain agenda. Getting at the actual truth, the raw data, is very difficult. So if we want to talk about gender integration and a standards-based military, well, if it takes a certain amount of upper body strength to change the track on a tank, that's the physical reality of doing that kind of a job. But if the testing about men and women doing that particular job reveals that in most cases, a woman doesn't have the upper body strength to do that, well, that doesn't really align with the desired outcome, right? So these things have nothing to do with the goodness or badness or the value of a human being. It's, do these political agendas seek a particular outcome? And then they skew data and reporting and surveys to support that particular outcome. So that's where I think that administrations or political activists really don't support the public in a helpful way by reporting truth and the raw data and how that was accomplished, right? So I mean, we've talked a lot about various groups, whether it's women or a racial minority or sexual preferences or identities, all those sorts of things, and these are very big hot button issues. But I think what we're trying to do in this conversation is say, what is the ground truth within the military? How do that relate to military effectiveness? And from a purely secular standpoint, if a military unit can go to the field, work coherently, cohesively as a team, and perform its primary function of winning in combat, right? That should actually lead all of these discussions.
Right.
Now, that unit is comprised of people drawn from society.
Yeah.
So if American society writ large has internalized and normalized, certain relationships and identities, then what's the problem?
Right.
Okay. Now, if it's completely secular, how does that relate to the identity of America, its values basis? Is it mostly kind of a Judeo-Christian driven sort of thing? I don't know of anybody who's arguing for the United States to be a theocracy. That has its own problems.
Right.
And so over the past couple hundred years, it's been just a fascinatingly successful exercise in balancing all of these particular issues. But the dangers that you bring up is arbitrarily imposing a political agenda on the military, often termed wokeism, right? And these politically desired sorts of policies, and how that affects the effectiveness of the military, right? And are we doing more harm than good? And I'm convinced it's doing more harm than any conceivable good at present.
Yeah, I think the arbitrary aspect,
Right.
it's where it's not really connected to anything that will make the military more effective or that is directly representative of society.
And I think it's important for your viewing audience, right, to understand how the military culture works. And so civil military relations, the military is subject to civilian control and authority. That is a wonderful thing. We do not want the military as its own political entity.
Certainly not.
Or refusing, implementation orders from, the executive branch. I mean, it's unconstitutional, and it would be destructive to the country. So a new president comes into office. They then recommend very, very important key officials to run the military department, serve as Secretary of Defense, and all these other sorts of positions. If Congress and the Senate confirms those people, now you have administration individuals scattered throughout the Department of Defense that can formulate and implement various policies. So if we use climate change as an issue, the Obama White House said climate change, combating that is really important, and it's an existential threat to the U.S. We want the military to study that. What was the political appointees that did the studies, and then the Pentagon reports back, oh, we're in complete agreement that climate change poses an existential threat to the United States. And then the White House would say, see, even the military is saying that this is a big deal.
And how often does that happen?
Yeah, so it's because of the political structures that you ask for a study that's going to report back to you the very things that you want. And I think we see the same things playing out with discussions about critical race theory, about various attempts to impose a progressive agenda on the military, where through that political class, right, and then they get the concurrence of the military. Well, it's only because they were your people that were reporting back anyway. Right,
and this is so important, I think, even especially to the left, actually, to when they can somehow say that the military actually is on board with their political agenda, that is a wonderful battering ram for them.
It is.
And so I think that is definitely a goal. It makes sense. Like, the military is,
and it's a manufactured battle.
Exactly. And the military is usually one of the last holdouts of a lot of these institutional or like political debates. They usually kind of try to stay out of a lot of it. So I guess
I could just real quick on that. And it's because of the world in which the military has to work.
Yeah.
So this is going to sound like a weird kind of diversion here, but I think it's important. Is that as the U.S. or any culture shifts from an agrarian sort of society to more of an urban society, they start to lose touch with the daily experiences of dealing with the physicality of the world.
Yeah.
So if you were
That's an
primarily
excellent point.
agrarian, you're raising the chicken and the cattle, and you're slaughtering the chickens and the cattle for food on the table. So you have firsthand, hands-on experience for the whole life and death cycle. Today, we go to the grocery store and you get a package of vegetables or a pound of hamburger or something like that, and you're divorced from what it took to actually produce that stuff. Similarly, in security sorts of arrangements, if you are operating alone, outside of some urban environment, you have to think about personal security. How do you provide for your family? What does it take to, drive a wagon 100 miles to whatever the next town would be, right? So there, again, there's this close connection between the physical realities of the world, right, and what your concepts are. As you get further and further removed from that, you can come up with all kinds of crazy ideas and then try to implement them because you only have to deal with the consequences. I mean, it's a consequence-free sort of world. So we could say 50% of our military needs to be, one-armed, orange-skinned, triple gender individuals, something crazy like that. And you can implement that, and all the numbers would say, well, this is working fine for 10 or 20 years. Well, it's because you haven't taken that force to war.
Right.
So the consequences of a military failing in battle are so profound that we run risk. And that's why the military is inherently conservative, inherently reluctant to make big substantive changes, because the consequences of those changes can be so severe that you don't get a second turn at bat.
Right.
A business can fail and another business steps in to take its place. Right. You got a lousy school, I can, teach my kids at home, right, in the educational environment. If your military fails in war, I don't know how you bounce back from that.
No, certainly not, especially when the society that it's operating within is already so fragile to failure. So I'm actually, going a little bit back to this arbitrary, arbitrary political kind of ideology being imposed on the military. What's this might be kind of like a hypothetical more so, but it's what happens when they're successful, fully successful in politicizing the military to the point where now it becomes an arm of a specific political party. Obviously, we've seen this happen in other countries throughout history. We know that the CCP basically operates that way. And is that something that you foresee the United States ever going down that path? Do you think it's possible? Do you think we should be much more aware of those consequences to help keep ourselves out of these?
I think it's always
situations?
possible. I mean, this is all very speculative. How do you envision the United States 50 years from now? I don't know what's going to happen 6 months from now, but history is an excellent guide, right? So how have things like the Chinese Communist Party, the People's Liberation Army is an arm of the Communist Party in China. And it helps to maintain its power, just as the North Korean military supports Kim Jong-un, the Iraqi military kept Saddam Hussein in power for decades. So if that's the path you want to go down, and that the military is an extension of the political party in power, then the people lose trust and confidence in the military because it's just a coercive element of whoever the ruling political masters are, right? So why would you want to join them? How do we expect the military to behave? In the United States, we go to bed not having to worry about somebody showing up at our door in the middle of the night, busting in, and then dad or mom disappears and you never see them again. Unlike in Afghanistan or Syria or Iran, these other places where the ruling elite will not they won't tolerate any kind of dissent. So if it is seen here in the United States that the military has become an extension of an ultra-progressive leftist administration, I think the consequences of that could be very profound. Are we there yet? Absolutely not.
Right.
Are the risks so high of things going horribly bad years down the road such that you can't allow any of this stuff to enter? I think that's the case. So that's why you see such an aggressive pushback by conservatives
Yeah.
against this progressive leftist agenda, because they think if it goes unchallenged
Yeah.
and it becomes firmly rooted, then you will cease to have a U.S. military that anybody can take pride in. We certainly won't see people wanting to join it,
Yeah.
Willingly, and it being used as an instrument of power abroad.
Right.
I think it could just be disastrous.
Yeah, so I want to talk about that, the national security aspect of all of this. With what are we? This is a very public issue right now. It's not something that's just happening behind the curtains politically. China and Russia are very aware of kind of these attempts culturally in the United States and how it's kind of leaking over into the military. What do you think they're thinking about all this? Do you think they're kind of like reveling in it? Yes, they're gonna be so easy to be in like 20 years when we're ready to go at them,
right?
Or what do you think they're saying?
I think we've entered a very dangerous window of opportunity. Again, context is everything, right? So if you look at a country like China or Russia, they have their own domestic issues.
Certainly, yeah.
Right? So do they have aging populations? Well, for example, given the size of China's population and the consequences of its one-child policy for many years, it is rapidly getting older before it gets rich.
Right.
As it becomes much more militaristic in its approach in its region, it's causing other countries like Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and others to also start to muscle up, right? Because they're not just going to sit there and let China take over the Indo-Pacific region.
Right.
And so you see this kind of awakening in these other countries to spend more on their defense and to start pushing back politically. So if we use China as an example, right now, it is militarily dominant in the region.
Right.
It's an economic powerhouse. It keeps making promises to its people about retaking Taiwan, right? Bringing it back in. Because of the number of people it has, it's in desperate need of energy and protein sources, hence these clashes over fishing rights and those sorts of things. So from the Chinese perspective, they likely have a closing window of opportunity in the 2020s. Right, when some of these things really start hardening. So now you look at the United States, self-absorbed, just consumed with identity politics. America is inherently racist. All of you people who are in certain minority groups are just serial victims, causing majority populations to start saying, hey, wait a minute, there's a lot of reverse discrimination that's occurring here. And so they would view the United States as in disarray, as an unserious country. And the recent defense budget that's been proposed, the budget doesn't even keep pace with inflation. So all other departments in the federal government averaged a 16% increase in spending for 2022. The military is less than the rate of inflation. Right. So it's actually losing purchasing power as stuff gets older and smaller. So if you're in Moscow or Beijing, you're saying that America is distracted, it's disrupted, it's fighting against itself, it's weakening, it's adding to its debt load. Maybe now is the time to move. And so we help facilitate problems growing much more severe than they would be otherwise. It causes our allies to question, is the United States going to be there for us or not? If you look at what happened in Afghanistan here, and you were Israel or Taiwan or Lithuania, do I need to seek accommodation with the bigger, stronger, neighbors in my region?
And we've already seen China basically reaching the Taliban in China are in cahoots already.
Absolutely. So it's the agenda, the progressive agenda being pushed forward in Washington, D.C., affecting the military. And they're doing that without really thinking through the broader strategic consequences of the United States as a whole, and certainly our position in the world.
You mentioned earlier conservative pushback on this. I'm curious, how have people either in Congress or in the private sector or in the military been pushing back against these arbitrary impositions? Where does free speech kind of fit into all of this? Because, we've talked about earlier, we've seen people get pushed out of the military when they do speak up against this, even if it's on their own time.
So this is where another example of the military being a very odd kind of organization, I mean, it's so heartening to see parents that are challenging their local school boards. with critical race theory and identity politics and other things being pushed into even elementary school
Oh yeah.
education,
Bad,
right? And so in that world, in the civilian world, mom and dad can show up on, comment night and really lay into these people who were elected into their positions. They can vote them out of office, so it's this wonderful popular pushback to say, we're not going to tolerate this sort of nonsense. Elected representatives in Congress, many members of Congress have stood up to their microphones and made public statements, taking military leadership to task and taking the administration to task for imposing these sorts of progressive agenda items as well. The odd part about the military is it's very difficult to do that within the military.
Right. So it has to be mostly from the civilian side.
I think it has to be from outside. So if the average American is concerned about the damage that the progressive agenda might cause or would cause on the military, it's incumbent upon the voters to either vote out or vote in people who have a more conservative, or I would say a productive, agenda for the country, for their representatives in Congress. This popular public pressure to do for the military what the military in some ways cannot do for itself. Now, senior leaders could proverbially, falling on your sword, you could resign, and that is certainly an option, that you don't want to be party to propagating and imposing and enforcing policies that would be damaging to the military. And that's a fairly extreme step.
Right.
Because can it be viewed as the military kind of politicizing itself and not following the orders of the elected officials, that it is subject to, right? So Andy Milburn is a retired Marine colonel, wrote a wonderful essay about kind of responsible pushback. When do you refuse to follow an order? It may be legal, it may be lawful, but if it's not wise, at what point does a senior military official protest that? And Lieutenant Colonel Lohmeyer, who is a Space Force unit commander, in his own kind of private capacity, was pushing back against this critical race theory, and the system, in a political system, bounced him from, relieved him of command. So we do see instances where military officials are on the uniform side are pushing back, but it's a very delicate balance.
Certainly. I mean, do you think these service leaders actually, do you think there's any opening, or I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, of trying to instill a culture within the military services of speaking one's mind a little bit more, or pushing back, or do you think that would be detrimental actually to the way
again, it's a balancing act, because the American way of war and what we expect our young men and women to do is to think for themselves, right? So mission command is a phrase that you've likely heard of. You get into a battle space, the commander is going to say, this is my understanding of the situation, this is what we're trying to accomplish, but I can't be everywhere all the time. So you, understanding my intent and the larger mission, what we're trying to accomplish, I really need you to think independently. You've got to make your own decisions in accordance with the overall objective of what we're trying to accomplish. So that's one idea of a personal initiative, of individual identity, of confidence, making good decisions in this kind of heat of the moment. That is different than everybody deciding for themselves what the mission needs to be. Or saying no to somebody in their chain of command, because they don't agree, or they don't like the person's skin color or something like that, right? So it's kind of situation dependent, and it calls for maturity and wisdom and a willingness to accept the consequences if you say no and you were in the wrong.
Because if you're just a company commander, for example, and you're saying that, you're being ordered to give this diversity, equity, inclusion training, and you see the curriculum and you realize that you're going to have to segregate people in the lesson plan, you're going to have to do all these things. That's like a mid-level officer. So what do you do at that level? When is there a culture is there even a place for you to push back there?
So there's so many things, is the battalion commander, or this company commanders, the type of commander who would allow for that kind of debate to occur inside the command. He brings in all those company commanders. Hey, this is what we've been told to do. Here are some of my thoughts. If he says, I don't agree with this policy, well, then you are conveying to your subordinates that you are going to oppose this policy that's being handed down. So you could go down a path where there's just rank insubordination, a breakdown in discipline, chain of command authorities, right? Now, if you're the individual company commander and in good conscience, you just cannot support following through on this, then it's an individual decision, to resign or to lodge a formal protest, and then really needing to work within that system. So we call, and this again, it's another wonderful aspect of our military, is that we call on our men and women to really be mature adults. And there aren't, black and white, 0 and 1, clear answers in every situation. Sometimes it's a judgment call, and you have to be able to articulate the reason for why you're doing something in a certain way, and subject to law, be willing to suffer the consequences of whatever that is. And it's easier to do and to deal with these issues if the public is behind you. So again, for the average American, the regular American, taking the initiative as well and speaking up and writing letters, and how you vote. Votes matter. Who you put into office. Do we have a government in office that wants to push forward progressive agenda items or not?
So to go back on kind of the heart of all this, which is where I brought up military services up, obviously, because tomorrow is the 20th anniversary of 9/11, which was, I mean, especially for my generation, a very significant point in history. I not to like say my age, but I was, in 8th grade, and like it opened a lot of kind of, in the millennial generation, it opened our eyes up to the fact that the world was a bigger place, because when you're that age, you're still kind of operating within your town and within your like schools. You're not really thinking beyond that too much. So it really kind of thrusted us into thinking more externally. And then a lot of my friends ended up enlisting and going into the military to fight specifically in Iraq during the surge. And that was just kind of like a really emotional time for everyone, because, people were coming back, and, there was a lot of sacrifice. But there was a lot of support for military service at that time, just a lot. So just in saying all of that, I recently saw, I forget where it was, an article about how for 9/11, how they're going to teach it at certain schools is by using specific woke language, making sure that they coddle the students in such a way that they really aren't exposed to the gravity of that day. And so like when you're teaching it, how it's going to be, taught, it's worrisome that the younger generations are not going to really fully see this. And I know that, in hindsight, I'm like, okay, I'm sure every generation worries about this. Obviously my generation doesn't look at World War II the same way as if they were alive at that time. But just being, me and being aware of all this, I'm curious what your thoughts are on how this is going to be taught, how it's going to be talked about, if there's going to be a rewriting of history. We've already seen, obviously, very clear evidence. Just this last weekend, they took the Statue of Reconciliation down in Richmond because it was of General Lee, but even though it was supposed to represent reconciliation in this attempt to rewrite history and the understanding of the Civil War. I'm curious if you think they're going to attempt to rewrite history on 9/11, and kind of how.
Yeah, they are trying to do that. I think that the first comment would be is it's very insulting of people that the folks who are pushing this sort of an agenda, right, of protecting students, etc. What they're essentially saying is you have no ability to think for yourself, to be presented the truthfulness of acts that go on. So I am going to shape the material because you just don't have the ability to determine for yourself. I mean, well, how insulting is that? It's like in some of our either in the gender identity politics or in the racial politics or what have you, based on your particular skin color, racial background, it is not within you to rise above your circumstances. And so the government has to help you out in some way, right? So it's
you're dumb and poor and incapable.
That's right.
And we're here to help.
Oh, we're going to solve all your problems, right? So I think it's insulting, and it doesn't take into account the strength of individuals, the intelligence of individuals, that they can figure these things out. Just give me the information and I'll figure out how I interpret this and those sorts of things, right?
Right.
Now, obviously, we don't expect a 4-year-old to think like a 30-year-old, although
Right.
a lot of 30-year-olds think like 4-year-olds. But in general,
Oh boy, do they.
yeah, people are capable. So I
Yeah.
think that's one thing. The second point is it really breeds weakness
Yeah.
in many, many ways. If you
Mhm.
have somebody who never engages in any kind of physical activity, well, they're actually more prone to health problems
Mhm.
because the body isn't being strengthened.
Right.
If people are never challenged in some way, well, they never have an opportunity to rise to the challenge, to
Right.
find out what they're capable of, to develop self-confidence that you can deal with
Yeah.
bad information. I mean,
Yeah.
or
difficult
scary,
to
difficult
understand,
times or
difficult.
something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
So if I'm
Mhm.
always trying to protect you, in the long term,
Yeah.
it makes you a weak, incapable, ineffective, scared, person, because
Yeah.
all of your problems have been either solved or prevented from ever being a challenge for you that enables you to figure out what you're really made of.
Right.
And
And
so,
from being an independent thinker.
well, absolutely. So, what a wonderful thing you were talking about in terms of, your generation rising to the call. So there was an awareness that there are evil forces out in the
Yeah.
world.
Mhm.
That even though you're safe and snug in Washington, D.C. or New York or on an airplane over Pennsylvania, that these external dangers can come home and
Mhm.
threaten us directly.
Yeah.
How many innocent civilians were there in the Pentagon or the World Trade Center towers
Yeah.
who were going about their daily lives and, completely outside of the control these dangers threaten? So I
Mhm.
was talking about, kind of that rural environment,
Yeah.
raising animals and killing animals and stuff, that there's a physicality to the world. And so in many of these academic discussions, China really doesn't present a threat.
They're
Or
so
the
far
mullahs
away.
in
Yeah.
Tehran, Iran really
Mhm.
don't present a threat, or terrorism springing up back out of Afghanistan really doesn't. That'll never happen. We'll never go to war with X, Y, or Z, right?
Mhm.
And it's just flat out lies. And so I think we actually do a better service and we show confidence in our youth by
Yeah.
presenting them the facts of events in history,
Yeah.
what has occurred. And like just in the days after 9/11, how many people came out,
Yeah.
hanging flags, proud of America, country music singers
Yeah.
publishing
It was
songs. I
everywhere.
mean,
Yeah.
it was everywhere. And that
Mhm.
starts, the further you get away from the incident,
Mhm.
that starts to kind of ebb,
Yeah.
and it's
Yeah.
just natural because life goes on, you start doing other sorts of things. But the younger generation today, while they might learn about 9/11 academically,
Yeah.
you really didn't live that time. We talked about earlier, right? That going to the airport to see somebody off at the gate or to meet
Yeah.
them at the
At the
gate.
gate. Yeah.
So
Yes.
pre-TSA, where now you
Yeah.
have to stand outside the airport almost, and let
Yeah.
people go through all these security cordons. If you didn't live that, it's really hard to understand how much the world has changed,
Yeah.
how we're creeping toward a surveillance state.
How much less freedom they have. Yeah, they are
Absolutely.
getting very comfortable and complacent with the idea of constantly being checked,
Mhm.
asked questions, answering to security
Right.
forces. It's
It's
it's a
this,
mental conditioning.
it's
Yeah.
a zero risk,
Mhm.
not being able to tolerate any risk whatsoever. So in this great debate of freedom of speech and personal
Mhm.
privacy
Mhm.
versus security.
Yeah.
So if I want to try to nip every conceivable security challenge in the bud before it can
Mhm.
even get a foothold, that means I need complete knowledge of what everybody's doing and thinking and saying and where they're going and who they're associating with.
Right.
So we would give up all of our sense of personal privacy, have
Right.
the government continue full surveillance on
Right.
the promise that they will keep all dangers away from us. So in kind of a metaphorical
Right.
sense, this idea of freedom,
Mhm.
personal choice, being able to make decisions for yourself carries with it a risk that something might not work out.
And
Right?
that's the biggest thing is being willing to take that risk.
You have to
Being
accept risk
Yeah,
in some way.
exactly. And this is totally off topic, but it explains why there are so many people today in America, which always really surprised me because you're like, America wouldn't do this, who are willing to say, yeah, I'll show my COVID vaccine card.
Yeah. Well, it
And I'm
could
just
be.
like, really? That's unusual. But then you've got France, actually, they're the ones burning their cards, right, in
Right.
protest.
Yeah.
So I'm just like, wait, there seems to be a disconnect here
Yeah.
with who's supposed to
The
be.
intrusion of government in
Yeah.
every aspect of American life, and it's always couched in the most positive terms. We're doing this for the children. We want to protect people. We want to keep dangers. What's a nanny state? I mean, how
Yeah.
long has that phrase been around?
Right. Mhm.
So if you want to take charge of your own life,
Mhm.
then you're going to make decisions, and you have to accept that there are consequences,
Right.
good and bad.
Yeah.
Right, for those decisions. If we want our kids taught in school, they have to be exposed to the totality of the good things and the bad things about the world, the strengths and some of the flaws of the United States going back. And the beautiful story about America is we embrace the shortfalls and we improve them, right? I mean, that we fix those things. So America has given more opportunity for more people, not only in our own country, but around the world, than any other country or idea has in the history of mankind.
And that's the story of America.
It is.
And that's why it's so important. I think people really understand American history and all of this, because those are the same things that you mentioned with the nanny state term, the rhetoric that was used, the narrative around all of that. Like, you need us to help you. You need us to help coddle you and protect you. Those were the excuses that the king gave when he imposed taxes, when he, forced people to quarter his soldiers. That's what led to the revolution. That's what we were born out of, was this resistance to, no, we don't actually need the government for all of these things. That's not what, that's not what rulers are for. That's not what we want rulers to be representative of. And that is because that's kind of in our blood as Americans, and it should be something that that we carry all the way through into the military.
And it cycles all the way back to the critical race theory and the military and all that stuff, right? That if I work hard, if I'm competent, if I'm fair, if I treat people with dignity and respect, then shouldn't that be recognized and advanced, right?
Right.
Or should all these things be viewed through the lens of race?
Yeah.
That regardless of how good or capable or fair or just you are, because you have a certain racial background,
right,
then I'm going to characterize you as oppressed or an oppressor, right? And so are we a society based on merit and mercy and justice, rightness, that stuff? Or are we a society or a country of desired outcomes, equity or equal outcomes for all people instead of equal opportunities for all people? And so the military typically in 99% of time is based on merit, respect, adherence to chain of command, discipline, all those sorts of things. So when you start messing with that and introducing these external factors, like we're going to define the military by race or demographic makeup, or we're going to force you to accurately represent the diversity of the country, we're going to force those kinds of outcomes, you start destroying the very things that make the U.S. military as effective as it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you so much, Dakota, for joining Well Said. Really appreciate having you here. Well Said is a bi-weekly live show where I interview policy experts, commentators, students, and activists on various issues regarding free speech, higher education, but American culture and policy as well. You can share this episode on Facebook or on YouTube. We also have a podcast, and you can share us on Anchor, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the usual platforms. Give us a 5-star rating if you like what you hear. I'm Cherise Trump, and Dakota, that was Well Said.
Wonderful. Thanks.